should be off. Okay, good evening everyone and welcome back to the Institute for Northern Studies public seminar series. For those who don't know me, my name's Dr. Andrew Lind. I'm a lecturer here at INS and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. Now I've got my usual list of housekeeping that I'll very quickly rattle through so we can get on to the main event, but before we get underway this evening, it's just a reminder that this session is being recorded and that it will be made available on the INS YouTube channel so you can relive all the action again at your leisure, and you can send it to all your friends and students as well. Now, that obviously means that if you don't want to appear on the recording, can I just ask that you ensure that your camera and microphone are switched off for the duration. However, we do want to get you involved this evening, so if you do have any questions, feel free to use the chat function at any point during the presentation, and we'll either address them as they come up or we can address them at the end. And what we'll do is once Frank has finished speaking, I will unlock everyone's mics and cameras so that they can put their questions to the man himself if you so desire. Now, our speaker this evening is one of those people that really doesn't require much of an introduction because everybody knows him, but it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Frankrennie back to UHI this evening. Now, as most of you know, Frank was Professor of Sustainable Rural Development at UHI and is still a research fellow at UHI Environmental Research Institute. Formerly, he was the head of research at Lews Castle College UHI, and he is a natural scientist with his research interests including human ecology and new approaches to online networking for clear communication of higher education, science, and rural community development. He's been an advisor to several government bodies. He is a fellow of 4 learned societies, and as we were just saying, he has published over 40 books. And tonight, Frank will be speaking about one of those books in particular, Among the Layers of the Land. So it is my privilege to welcome tonight Professor Frankrennie.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Andrew. I hardly recognise myself from your introduction. It's great to see so many people, and it's great to see so many old friends and former students and colleagues and whatnot as well. So I really want just to be very flexible, very easy about this. Can you still see that? Yeah. The camera's been disabled. No.
No, you're fine, Frank.
No, okay. Yeah. I got a message to say camera's disabled. Okay, so I want to just talk about this book, Among the Layers of the Land. Before I do talk about that, I want to just give a slight disclaimer. This is in no way a sort of a vanity trip. I really want you to buy the book, but all the royalties from this book go to the Linda Norgrove Foundation to help with the situation for women and girls in Afghanistan. So I don't get a penny from this book, so I have no shame whatsoever in twisting arms to get folk to buy it and go there. So that's up front. The second thing is I don't have any prepared speech. I don't have any text or slides or PowerPoints or whatnot. I just want to talk away through the ideas behind the book because I think they're quite relevant to some of the things there with the Institute. And I have no problem if anybody wants to butt in any time. Andrew will sort of will help me on this and feed questions or fence things as it goes through there. But I have no compulsion about stopping to sort of explain things in more detail or even argue the point. And hecklers are welcome. So that's your invitation, Rona, to say something at some point. Among the Layers of the Land follows through really from a book I did earlier on Galson, on the village on where I live here. The Changing Out Their Hebrides, Galson and the Meaning of Place. I was intrigued by the idea of taking the story of a village that I knew intimately, obviously, through from the beginning of the formation of the earth right through to the present and even into the future. And that book got quite a lot of attention. And then, so Among the Layers of the Land is a divergence from that because I was intrigued by how people think about the land and what we look at the land and see the land and how we look at it. People come here and they look at the moor and they think, oh my God, that's bleak. That is just terrible. How can you live here? To me, it's not bleak. To me, it's full of life. It's full of enthusiasm. There's great things to do and see, the history, the people are part of that landscape if you only know what you're looking at. And so I began to write a bit about the layers of the land and looking at the land. I'll come on to Neil Gunn in a second, but it's a wonderful quote from Neil Gunn that sort of was central to the idea of thinking about this. But I wanted to give it a spin. And so this book, the first chapter, the first one is a non-fiction text, and the next chapter, chapter 2, is fiction. Chapter 3 is non-fiction. Chapter 4 is fiction, all the way through. And within the non-fiction chapters, there are some things that really make you, raise your eyebrows and say, "Really, is that true?" And they are true, and I've sourced them, but they're quite, quite jaw-dropping in some cases. Like, for example, we might talk about this later on. The Russian maps, the Russian maps of the world that were discovered purely by accident, including places like this. Conversely, the following chapters, the fictional chapters, the short stories, also have elements of truth in them. And so the stories themselves are completely made up by myself. But within that, there's a punchline or a character or a situation or a particular aspect that is true, that caught my attention, and I wove a story around that. So I'm interested in the idea of actually just blending back and forward to different ways of how we think about the land and characters of the land and people's reactions to the land. And so the subtitle of the book is Stories of People, Perspectives and Place. So it's about how we think about the land and the landscape. I think that, central to this part of it was this idea from Neil Gunn. Neil Gunn wrote a wonderful novel. I think it was his last novel, in fact, The Other Landscape. I've talked about this before, but The Other Landscape is, well, Gunn is regarded nowadays as quite a difficult author because he's quite deep in some cases, and he has lots of allusions. He doesn't necessarily spell things out in tabloid format like the Daily Mail or whatever, but he alludes to things, and he brings in things that you have to know about and think about, and the sort of things will sort of bubble within you for a while before you, maybe it'd be weeks or months later before you realize, oh my God, that's what you meant. So The Other Landscape is one of those books, and The Other Landscape is based on the idea that you walk along the street and you meet this person and you say, "Oh, hello, how are you doing?" You shake hands. You say, "How's your mother? What's the weather like?" And you have a chat, and then you move on. And then half an hour later, you meet somebody else and you go, "Oh, hello, how are you doing?" And you shake hands and say, "What's the weather like? How's your mother doing?" And you move on. And you know instinctively that you like the first person and you don't like the second person. And you wonder why. Was it the body language? Was it the shifted behavior? It was something that you saw, you picked up from that encounter that was, in all intents and purposes, exactly the same, but it was completely different in the two different encounters. Well, some people look at the land that way, and I think I'm one of those people. You look at the land, and you see things automatically. You pick out the flushes of greenness on the moor, then you know that that's either a watery area, a boggy area. And the Gaels have, I think, 49 different names for different types of bog, depending on whether they're strong bogs or weak bogs or dangerous bogs and so on. Or it might be a particular area that's useful for something, for peat cutting. So, for example, the peatland here is divided into different sections depending on different crofts, and if they still cut peat, they'll cut in those areas. You just can't wander out in the moor and start cutting wherever you want. But there are no signs up. There is nothing to tell you this belongs to this family and this belongs to some other family. It's just one of these things that you pick up on a cognitive map of your growing up, of your belongingness, your identity to a place. So looking at those lands, looking at that landscape from that, and again, there's a whole series. In fact, there's an interesting series just now on the Geology Society of America's newsletter that which is something I've said for ages, that geologists view the world differently. I originally was a geologist way back in the mists of time. Geologists look at the land differently and cognitively differently. So there's a series of papers that have been published in the newsletter, co-written by a neuroscientist and a geologist, looking at different situations. And the way that they look at the landscape, the way when I go to a new place, it doesn't matter whether it's, you know, Tenerife on holiday or, you know, some further apart. You look at the place and you begin to size up the landscape, and you think about what makes that land and how it works and how it all strings together. And thinking about that is something that you want to think about. It's a perspective that you wouldn't get unless you're actually aware of how the land is built up. I'll try and find something that I can maybe describe that. Hang on. Yeah. So let me just read something from this. This is not quite at random, but more or less at random. It's one of the chapters about chapter 5, layers of meaning. I think there are, the title of the book, The Layers of the Land. These things come in layers and palettes, and it's not one or the other. So history is laid on top of the geomorphology, that's laid on top of the hydrology of the area, the geology, and so on and so forth. So I'll just read a section of it to give you some sort of feel. It says, when we look at the landscape or immerse ourselves deeply in a place, we see it as a certain observed reality. There are many ways in which we can measure or describe the appearance of reality. Some obvious factors that could be employed are the physical parameters, the latitude, the longitude, the altitude of the place, its humidity, its climate, its air quality. Then expanding the idea of place beyond a single footprint of land to encompass an entire section of the landscape, we might add the consideration of the aspect, the direction it faces, towards the sun or to the shade, as well as the complete hydrological system, the soil types, the covering vegetation, the habitats that provide for the various species of fauna and flora in that place. We might ponder the differences in the atmospheric conditions of the place, the weather, the climate, the effects of the weather over a long period of time. And of course, there are the impacts that the human species has made in that place, both the physical and positional changes, the roads, the farms, the drainage, the buildings, and the intangible aspects of society and culture, the legends, the stories, the songs, old images, names on a map, and other heritage examples. This is the terrain, T-E-R-R-A-I-N, the surface features of the landscape spreading out before us. And then there's the terrain, T-E-R-R-A-N-E, the geologist three-dimensional block of earth that extends below the superficialities of the surface to include the millennia of rock strata that quite literally supports the world that we walk upon. So I've tried to, I mean, this is a, I wouldn't say it's an academic book, but it's a scholarly book, I think. When I've quoted things that you think, oh, that's not right, that can't be right, that figure or that idea, I've given the source, the reference for that in the back of the book, so you can be encouraged to go and look at that yourself and follow these things up. A good example of that, I'm going to stop in a second or two and then see if there are any questions, and if not, I might give you another reading. But a good example of that, for example, is this idea about the Russian maps of the world. So basically, I've been speaking to Chris Fleet, who's the head curator of the Map Library of Scotland. We've done a few things together and book festivals and so on and projects. And he mentioned this to me, and I went back when I was doing this book and said, you mentioned this a while back, tell me more about this. So he told me more and he gave me a reference. Basically, from the time of Stalin right through to Gorbachev, the Russian Secret Service mapped the world in secret, literally mapped the world. So there are maps of Aberdeen, Glasgow, Wolverhampton, whatever else, Canadian prairies, in Russian. And I got hold of the maps for Lewis, for here. And you look at these maps and it has the phonetic pronunciation of the villages, but written in Russian Cyrillic script. It has roads that have numbers beside them that indicate the width of the road. The bridges have a figure beside them to indicate the load-bearing capacity of the bridge. There are things on these maps. Originally, they were thought to be straight rip-off copies of Ordnance Survey maps and put into Russian, but they discovered that there are a number of things on the Russian maps of secret military establishments, MOD establishments in this country, for example, that are not on our OS maps, but are on the Russian maps. And undoubtedly, some of this could be mapped from space or from satellite spy planes and so on and so forth. But there's enough evidence to show that there were people moving around us for decades, slightly mapping the landscape. And these figures on the roads and the bridges and whatnot, because if you're heading for Garabust, you don't have to understand how to pronounce it in Gaelic or English. You just say it in Russian in the script. And it tells you, the tank commander, how big the road is and how heavy, how strong the bridge is. And these were discovered by accident. When the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians were able to pull these things together within Russia itself, but they couldn't control the fluid situation in the satellite states of the Soviet Union. And so Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, etc., these things were just more or less abandoned. And basically, two squaddies, and I think it was Lithuania, were told, destroy this warehouse full of maps. And they thought they'd make a quick buck by flogging that to a local shop. And the guy who was selling maps in the local shop bought a pallet or two of these things. And a couple of years later, he was giving a talk in Berlin, and a couple of UK academics went to his PowerPoints. Hang on a minute, that's interesting. Where did you get that stuff? And that's when they started. At that point, nobody knew anything about these. And they discovered there are thousands and thousands of maps. There were thousands of people employed to do that at one time. So just looking at these maps of this place through that lens of another culture, another place, is quite. I mean, the story of, for example, Hitler's maps of the UK and German for preparing for the operation for the invasion of Britain during the Second World War. That's quite a well-known story. But this stuff about the Russian maps was not known until very, very recently. And again, I've documented some of that stuff and given some of the papers and key references within that. So again, there are different ways just thinking about these things and how it all strings together. I don't know if that springs any questions or any issues and whatnot. You want to go through there, or will I just push on?
I don't think there's anything in the chat just now, Frank. But I'll give folk a minute if they do want to ask a question at this point. Otherwise, we can just save everything to the end.
Okay. Let me give you a piece of the. Let me give you a piece. I'm not going to give you the punchlines of the stories and spoil the thing for you. But this is just a piece that talks about. Again, it's about people's attitudes towards place, and this idea of belonging to a place and being hefted to a place. This is talking about a young family within a place within Lewis, which is you could basically pick your name and anywhere within Orkney, Shetland, the North Coast, and so on and so forth. Another half a dozen years were to pass before this realization resurfaced, however. And after a regular return visit home, sitting on the same dike, he wished more than anything that he didn't have to catch the ferry on Monday morning. There's a Gaelic word for it, bontiness. I suppose that means belongingness, is the nearest words in the English language. It doesn't just mean where you come from, it's deeper than that. It's who your people are, who your connections are in the community, your whole heritage, your rootedness. You don't need to study bontiness, it just grows in you, a slow awakening. If we're one of the Asian countries, we might call it enlightenment. And with this gradually emerging realization, came a change in Peter's lifestyle. his pace of work altered, not slower as he might have imagined, but faster to accommodate his preparations to return home and find job opportunities at home, and yet still keep pace with his normal employment. When the time came for him to move, the release of emotion was like a downpour on the moor. The turbulent flow of his life tumbled, white froth bubbling and coloured brown with peaty earth of his own place. Walking on the high road that weekend, he knew that this was still not enough. On Monday, he went into Stornoway to speak to the estate agent. So this is about a family returning to a place that was uninhabited within the area. This is why, I mean, I don't deal with the issue directly with this thing here, but I mean, like many other people within the Highlands and Islands, the word rewilding is like touching a match to a tinder fire to me. I thoroughly believe in ecological restoration. I thoroughly believe in managing land in a way that's environmentally friendly. But the concept of rewilding, to me, really, and many others, I guess, implies that you're putting this land back into its wild state, when in fact that wild state is only created artificially because people have been removed from that landscape. There's lots of research, and our colleague at UHI, Elizabeth Ritchie, wrote a good paper a couple of years ago, showing that in many areas, when people were in the glens and living in these places and crofting in those areas, the biodiversity, the ecological framework was actually much broader, much more varied than it is nowadays. And so the idea about making this place a natural haven for wildlife because it's empty is actually quite paradoxical to me. And I would like to see more engagement with communities to manage their own land. And this is where the great thing about things like community land trusts have come in here, where people are taking a long-term vision and saying, this is our land, we want to manage it, we don't want to asset strip it, we want to encourage wildlife, we want to encourage responsible management, we want to present it to incomers and visitors and tourists in the way that we feel comfortable with, that we feel self-confident with, not to be stuck in some sort of museum situation and aspect. So again, I've tried to reflect some of that within there. The book is not preaching these things, but it contrasts in some of these attitudes and tries to bring some of these out as to try to encourage folk to think about ways in which they might engage with some of these things. Another bit here, for example, this is again this is a chapter called Layers of Territory, and it's about, again, this idea of buntiness, is belongingness. You can't avoid your buntiness. It's like part of your DNA. You can move to Canada, you can remarry, you can change your religion, but buntiness is inherent. It's the baggage that goes along with you, and you may like it or not, but that's part of your connectedness to the world, as it were. Further inland, it's a different scenario. At the edges of the village, a gull colony is reoccupied afresh each spring. And with the gulls returning to inhabit their portion of this landscape, the bonxies, the great skuas, also reappear, and their relatives, the Arctic skua. I use the bonxie as a very deliberate example, for although the gulls are attentive in their aerial displays to defend their territory that they claim that they own, they are mere amateurs in comparison with the bonxie. Watch a bonxie for a day or two, and you can begin to understand the idea of an invisible mosaic of bird territories covering this landscape, the things that we don't see. The territories jostle together, overlying each other in an interactive framework of fiefdoms, some of which are mutually compatible and others which are in deadly competition. On a flattish expanse of moor, close to where I live, I performed a simple experiment. About 150 metres away, on top of a dry tussock that rises no more than half a metre above the surrounding land, but enough to give that extra height to scope a wider view of the landscape, sits the solid, dark brown shape of a resident bonxie. As I walked directly towards the bird, he, who spotted my presence long before I saw it, rises skyward on spread wings. I stop at once and reverse my step. The bird settles down again. I walk 50 meters or so to my left, keeping my distance from it, then walk forward once more. The bird rises again. I repeat the process from every direction, moving clockwise around the position of the sitting bird. And each time I cross that invisible boundary, I get a similar response. And the patch of ground defined by the polygon within which the bonxie is prompted to rise most definitely marks the limits of its comfort zone. And I know from similar previous surveys that if I get any closer to the nest, I will be met with increasingly robust aerial challenges. Beginning with a brusque fly pass and graduating to hostile, speedy approaches around the height of my waist. The gulls will wheel overhead and screech in intimidation, swooping low for effect, but the bonxes will target your head and will make serious contact. So it's about, again, it's about this idea about belonging to a place, whether you're born and brought up there. People have asked me in the past, can you acquire this? Well, yes, you can. You can move into an area and you can, I guess, fit in the community. You bring your new ideas, but you can begin to understand the place in a way. This is why we all have our own favourite spots. We all have our own favourite places. Places that you come to and you think, oh, what a view, what an idea! That's a lovely place. This is my favourite spot on the planet. You don't necessarily want to live there, but you might do. But that then raises the question: what's triggered that for you? What combination of things, of fingerprints, has made it stand out for you and jump out, make you think about that place? Does it even have to have a name? Do you have to have a named place for it to actually be important within lifestyle? I think once you give a place a name, it has a locational basis. It has an idea that ties in a distance from somewhere or other, a certain distance away, a certain direction away, and therefore it becomes placed on a map. But we have this cognitive map. I've been reading just recently. I've been some of the stuff we're working on, looking at curlews, for example, and curlews will migrate and will come back to breed, and very often they'll come back to the same field and nest on the same tussock of grass that they nested last year. And so it's hefted not just to an area, but to a particular field. Obviously not every bird that does that. I mean, there are other birds that will regularly move around in a variety of different places. Some raptors will have a combination of nests and will use these in rotation, for example, but they come back to the same territory, the same hefted area. And when you think about things like the small wheatear going to West Africa and back again, you think, how is that possible? But then you think about that in terms of humans. There's a concept in Gaelic which doesn't really have a direct word. I guess it's more like homesickness, called Cianalus. Cianalus is extreme homesickness, and people have died of Cianalus. People have moved in between the world wars, the First and Second World War, when there were large migrations, just after the war, when people moved to Canada, and particularly and the States, and some cases Australia, New Zealand, they were moving away for life. They couldn't just pop back on EasyJet, and so it was a momentous event they were doing, and they were going for a whole variety of reasons: economic, social, cultural, whatever. But having done that, they were still hefted to this place to some extent. And literally, there are stories which I have in other places documented of people pining away because they were living and working in Canada, for example, but they couldn't get home, and it wasn't enough for them, and they couldn't get back. So this idea about looking at different ways of the land and the landscape, and taking the idea that, as I say, people can look at a place and say, "Oh, isn't that beautiful?" and somebody else says, "Oh my God, that's awful." I mean, people listen. This is looking out here, and all I see is wilderness, and yet to me, it's not wilderness at all. I've seen more wilderness looking at a hotel room in London and see nothing but concrete from horizon to horizon. That to me is barren. That to me is intimidating. Whereas a place like this takes a bit of while to get to understand it and get to know it. but by no means is it empty of life and stories and wildlife and imagination. I might flick through and give us something else here. So another example from that is I've got various things flagged up here, and I'm picking them more or less at random just to try and illustrate the point. There are at least 5 simultaneous ways to name a person in the Gaelic language. The first is their name in Gaelic, so Ian McGowan, for example. Then the same name in English, John Smith. Some people might have their birth name registered as John, but never get called John. They're always called Ian. Then they have their patronymic name. Who do they come from? Ian McGowan, the Callister, the Dolrug, John, son of the Smith, son of Alexander, son of Donald the Red, probably referring to his great-grandfather's red hair or red complexion. And then there's the possibility of a nickname or a descriptive name, because then there will be several persons of the same name in the school, in that class or in that village. So the person might also be named Ian Moore, Big John, or perhaps some obscure nickname given by his friends in jest because of his appearance or his hobby or his similarity to a contemporary. There are people here that were named after people who were film stars or pop stars at that particular time, and they had a similarity or a behaviour or a fascination within that stage, and that name stuck with them their whole life. Lastly, there might be a pet name or a familiar name. That's most commonly used to identify a person. So Donald might also get called Dan, in the same way as the English name Elizabeth might be rendered Liz, Lizzie, Betty, Beth, and so on. So it's not uncommon for people to actually have multiple personalities and multiple names depending on which situation they're in. People will go through. There are some people that I know personally, and even their wife calls them by their nickname. And it's many years later, but you discover what their name, their baptismal name was within the community, because nobody calls them that anymore. And so they have that multiple personality depending on what they're doing and what they do at different times. That also applies to places. Landscape can be intimidating one day, it can be beautiful the next day, it could be a place that you really don't want to see ever again, and so on and so forth. And that might be at multiple times, depending on what's happening in that particular part of your life or part of your experience with these things. It's why you travel to different places and experience things and say, oh my goodness, that was beautiful. Now, I was in Bhutan many times with work with the university in Bhutan and working with UHI. But there's a place in Bhutan called Membartso, and it's right in the middle of Bhutan. And the English name is called the Burning Lake, but it's not really a lake, it's just a big pool in the river. And the story goes that people were, it's festooned with prayer flags and votive ornaments and so on and so forth, thousands of them, in this small, basically Highland glen tucked away out of nowhere, with a tiny little road to it, not even a tarred road. And I was taken there at one point by my guests on the way back from a college workshop. And the story goes that the tradition there was they would hide sacred Buddhist scripts in different parts of the landscape, and knowledgeable people, tertons, enlightened monks basically, would recover these things over the course of time, and that place would be imbued with a certain aura, mystique. You might call it a sacred place or a holy place for that matter, but they don't necessarily call it that themselves. And in this case, the terton jumped into the stream, into the loch, swam underwater, pulled out the parchment with the Buddhist writing on it, and returned to the bank. And his candle had not gone out underwater, according to the story. And so there's a whole legend built around this. And when they started telling me this story, fascinating, I recognised the story. I'd had a fascination with this part of the world since I was, well, primary school, I guess. I don't know why. It's just one of these things that's caught my imagination over the years, and done a lot of work on the Himalayas in different parts. And I started to finish the story, and the entire minibus, the Bhutanese, just were absolutely struck dumb. And they said, "How do you know this?" And I said, "Well, I must have read it somewhere. I don't know." No. Nobody knows that about Bhutanese people. Nobody knows this story. And I said, "Well, I've probably read a lot somewhere." No. You think you've read it, but actually you've been here in a previous life. And so there was nothing I could do to persuade them that I hadn't been there in a reincarnation of myself as it goes through there, because that's the way that they view that landscape. Now, that's not the way I, or we in Western society would necessarily view that landscape. But it's a way of thinking of that. And when you think about that in terms of relating that to the old mythologies of Celtic lore or Norse lore, for example, it's not a million miles away. It's not a million miles away. There are stories about the giants creating the Giants Causeway in Ireland and going across across the straits to Scotland. There's a story within this community here. I can look out my window from here and see the butt of Lewis in daytime, and there's a hole in the butt where, according to legend, when the kings of Norway fell out with the King of Scotland, they put a rope through that to tow the Long Island back to Norway. And they got this far, and a storm broke up, and the islands began to break up and fall up, and Barra fell off, and South Uist and Benbecula, and so on and so forth. And then when they got to here, the rope broke, which is the reason why that Lewis is stuck in this place. Now we look at that and regard that as an amusing, Celtic tale, but actually, if you go back 1,000 years ago, it wasn't that far removed from reality. So this mirror quite interests me, this area between truth and reality, where one slips into the other, and where the evidence would seem to be one thing, but actually when you scrape the surface, you find some really interesting things afterwards. I mean, we've met, I saw Anna Gudrun on the list here, I've met people in Iceland that automatically will tell me emphatically that they have trolls at the bottom of their garden. And so I'm never quite sure if they're pulling my leg or if they're serious about this, but these things are within our history and our culture. That's how we view that landscape, which is why many of the places in the landscape have a naming structure. And although a lot of that naming structure has been lost now, we can tie a lot of that back to individual people or battles or particular occasions where, there's a a little bit south on the coast here. I have a friend, a couple who moved into the area, not from Lewis, and they were telling me about they were taken by a walk down by the Bay of the Pigs. And I said, I didn't know this place. So they yeah, quite certain. So we got the maps out and they showed me where it was, and it was by the Muck, and it's not Muck as in pig, which is Gaelic for pig, but it's Muckvara, which is the pig, the sea pig, the whales. So it's from the cliff that people would actually see the whales coming into the beach and coming into the shore there. And so it's easy how these things can get mangled and changed through time. But going back, there's a whole rich tapestry within the landscape that links the genealogy of people and place and crofts and areas and attitudes towards a place in terms of a particular style of thinking. Again, I don't know if there are any questions or if that's prompted people to think of questions. I've always got loads of other things I can do to don't worry about it, but if there are questions, that it would be quite to prompt.
Well, we've got Rona's got her hand up just now, so I'll let you pop your camera on, Rona, and you can ask a question. And we've got a couple in the chat, and then we can maybe see where we stand.
Okay.
Frank will be delighted to know that I actually, for some reason, can't put my camera on.
Oh, lovely.
Yes.
I have a mental image of you, Rona. Don't worry about it.
For those who don't know, Frank and I worked on my PhD together and both survived the experience. So the book is fascinating and I thoroughly enjoyed it. When you were talking just now, I was just thinking about how I have lived in different places and how, generally speaking, I have really singularly failed to get very attached to them. The one place I haven't lived, but I feel quite attached to, will not surprise you, and that's Lewis. Now, I find that very interesting. As you know, Frank, my late father was brought up in Lewis, but not born in Lewis. So, but I have no family in Lewis, but people who feel like family. But I feel very connected to it in ways that I still haven't quite worked out. There's an emotional connection, certainly, but there's other connections. And the more time I spend there, the more I start to look at it differently. And that's partly through all the studying that I did and time spending with you and other friends. But it's almost an intangible thing to me. Is that unusual, do you think, for you to form that attachment to somewhere that you've actually never lived?
Not at all. I think it's very, very, very typical, actually. I mean, I think I come of this. One of the things about being a writer is that all things sort of mushed into your head. So I'm not sure if it's in this book or the previous book, but I wrote about exactly this phenomena, Rona, because I said that there are three types of people that come here. There's people that come here and they get off the ferry or the plane or whatever else. They take one look and they go, "Oh my God, get me out of here! This is just not for me. I just can't live on an island. It's just terrible." And off, gone. There are other people that come back, like yourself, year after year after year. Don't necessarily want to stay here, but there are certain things. It's that fingerprint of emotions I was telling about. These things that trigger you within that. There are certain things that you actually that are attractive. I mean, migration is about push and pull. You know, it's about pushing you out of where you were, but there's had to be an attraction to go where towards your heading. So it's not just about the economic migrants or whatever else. It's a push-pull thing. So some people come again and again and again, and there are other people, and I would include myself within that category, who come and never go, never leave. and I can tell you lots and lots of people who have come for various reasons. For love or for jobs or for projects and whatever else, for holidays and whatnot, and they've got that, and they've just it's just twinged so many things, and it's set up a whole set of emotions that people actually identify with a particular, not even with a particular place. I mean, for me, I mean, I'm joking to some extent, but I'm also quite serious. I couldn't live any further south than where I am. This is on the edge of the boundary. I live in the I would say the edge of Ness. Again, this is a highly contentious thing to say in Lewis, because I mean, Ness is out there, and some Nishocks would say this is part of Ness, and other people would say that you're definitely not part of Ness. You're definitely somewhere else. But I would say I was a Sheeroch, a West Sider rather than a Nishoch. But people would come to that. Years ago, when I went to visit in New Zealand for the first time, it was absolutely stunning. It was like here. It was like being in Lewis, but it was warmer with palm trees. And I thought, wow, I could do this. I was discussing with the university a job there, but I didn't take it, and I think that was the right decision. I think that would have been a bad move for me. I think that was one of these places that it looks superficially like looking through the mirror, through the glass, Alice in Wonderland, and it was very, very similar, but it's not here. It's not here. It doesn't have the music on your doorstep. It doesn't have that mix of places and around. I walk through the village every day. Nowadays, I go through more or less the same route every day and go through the house. And when you do these things on a regular basis, there are things that become apparent that you just didn't see before. And you think, how the hell did I not see that for 40 years or 50 years or whatever? It's astonishing. And so just now, for example, walking around the village there, you will get skylarks at regular spots going vertically into the sky and singing because they're starting their breeding season and whatnot. And when I walk along that path every day or through the croft every day at that same place, those same birds will do the same thing every, the day. So it becomes an imprinted thing within you about recognizing the movement and whatnot. When you hear when you hear a cry of grey-lag geese, you know, in a certain tone, immediately stop and look around, because if you search the sky, you will probably see a sea eagle at some point, a white-tailed eagle at some point within the vicinity. And just a certain call that just triggers these things, and almost like in the same way as a mother knows her baby crying in a creche, you know, and that's the stuff there. So it triggers certain emotions as it goes through there. So I think absolutely it does. There are certain places, and I think in your case probably it just hasn't. There are not enough of these fingerprints, these echoes in common to break that bond and drag you. Maybe a few more would actually break the bond with wherever you are and actually take you over the edge to actually, God forbid, move to Lewis.
I don't want to worry you. I did notice there was a house for sale quite near you. But leave that one hanging. Thank you, Frank. It's enjoyable to hear you talk about your book. Thank you.
Perfect. There's a couple of comments in the chat kind of expressing similar things. Joanna said that she was recently driving through southeastern Estonia, looking for accommodation for students, and she went along twisty roads, and it felt very much like home. And Morag's also made a comment about our mother in Lewis, and that it's very much hefty to the landscape. Morag also made a comment when you were talking about this idea of rewilding, that it's like architectural conservation, when you can put it back to one point in time, but which point do you do? And it's like colouring old photos to suit your imagination. You're imposing your idea of something on the past in view of creating your own concept of authenticity.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We do have one question, Frank, before I'll let you go again. Oh no, we've got two. Simon's jumped in there as well. Joanna asked, and has been waiting very patiently, did you base your thoughts on the European Landscape Convention when it says that landscape means an area as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction with natural and/or human factors?
No, that's entirely from between my ears.
Okay. Just because Joanna said that, I think she very much agrees with your line of thinking, and that's something that she uses when she's teaching, and as she's covered in her research as well. And before I turn back to you, Frank, Simon's asked the question, do you have to go away to leave your place before you realise its true value to you?
Don't have to, I guess. There are people there. I think it's useful to. I can only speak personally, but I know that. I mean, I literally, as I said at the start to you, Andrew, that I've literally travelled the globe with work for my entire life, my entire career, and often when I was away somewhere, there's a switch just gets flicked after it could be 3 days, a week, a month, whatever else it is. There's a flick, a switch gets flicked, and I thought, yep, that's it, time to go home. That's it, done that, been there, got it. I've absorbed what I came to do. I've enjoyed it, or whatever else, you know. But now I need to get back. Now I need to go. And I think it's about that contrast, that contrasting perspective allows you to see things differently. I mean, in 1986, for example, I was very much involved in the Scottish Crossers Union at that time, and also working in nature conservation. And I had a fellowship in the States for 3 months rather, with an adult education centre. And I wrote about that at the time in the report to the trust, the fellowship trust. That to me it was like getting out of this community, the Highlands and Islands, and going there. And it was like seeing on the table all the bits of a jigsaw that I recognised, but I hadn't seen them in that particular format before. And so through the work that they were doing there, and the people I met there in Appalachia, it wasn't in the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, I met people that I recognised that were from here. That's like Johnny, that's like Donald, and so on and so forth. And through their activities and their behaviours and the things that they told me, I began to recognise things here from a different perspective. So when I came back, I had a clearer idea of what to do here in the community. And I think perhaps at that particular time, I don't know what age I would be, 20, under 30, I would say. I can't remember. Then it was, it would perhaps not have occurred to me if I was in the melting point here, doing these things, and everything was up close. You couldn't see the wood for the trees. Having got out of the community, in a different community entirely, that I had no intention of staying with that, but it was enough of a similarity in context and social context, etc., to come back and see it through a different perspective, things that were happening here. And it gave me that confidence, that assurance to do things in a certain way once I came back, because it was a reinforcement that these things actually work. And these things, certain things that I thought were unimportant, are very important to me. I spent this morning at lunchtime doing some stuff with the Royal Society of Edinburgh, helping to adjudicate a discussion there on health and social care and whatnot else. And one of the things that came across really strongly was the interconnectedness of rural communities and the social cohesion within the community. You can't imagine in some cases that same level of cohesion within a city, because you don't know necessarily who your neighbours are, far less the whole people on the street. But within the village, this small village where I live, you know everybody, you recognise everybody. You see people when somebody's ill, you know about their ill, and things like at the time of COVID, for example, there were elaborate services where people would pick up medication and messages and shopping for other people. And even if they weren't speaking them, they were doing this as part of the community. And so the cohesion is integrated. So the health is related to housing, it's related to employment, it's related to heritage, it's culture, it's language, it's, the whole thing, education, perceptions. And you don't have to be born and bred here to that things, but you have to understand it. The whole thing about empire very often was that people went across the empire and then tried to establish in India a little England that was like what they left behind, right? And that was what was the grit in the system that began to sort of ruffle people the wrong way, as it were. Accepting those traditions and cultures and ways forward, there's a lot we can learn from each other, but it's about living through a cohesive, integrated system that actually reinforces itself rather than thinking in silos and thinking this. And thinking about the land in that way is very important, because the land isn't just, and this is why the modern community land trusts in Scotland, for example, and the one in Galston here, for example, and Rona did a research on community land trusts, so she'll know what I'm talking about. These land trusts are more now, that some of them are going for 20 years and 20 odd years. They're not just about land. They're about land, they're about culture, they're about conservation, they're organising health walks, they're organising summer schools for kids within the community, they're looking at recycling schemes, they're looking at renewable energy, they're looking at reforesting, etc., etc., etc. There's a whole range of things there that are part of the culture and the heritage and the history of a place, not simply about land use and crofting, which an outsider might think is the primary or sole motive for the trust.
Anna, you have a question. Do you want to come on
in? Yes, I'll try to turn my camera on. Hi, Frank.
Hello there.
Nice to see you again.
Very good.
Yeah. I bought your other book and I read it. I liked it a lot, but I need to buy this one. It's very fascinating how you described it and everything. And I think I've been involved in a Arctic research project, Horizon, as you know, and we're starting a new one. And this is with the indigenous people, 3 Sami communities and one Inuit community. And in all respect of what is happening in the world, about Trump being so enthusiastic of owning, getting Greenland and so on, I believe place is becoming more relevant in that context, and what place means to people and what place and this belonging and he's just like the Russians. He's just looking at the map and see where things can be, what he can gain from it. Yeah. So and what we have been looking so much about is about this knowledge of a place. You live in a place and you gain a knowledge, and that is not often valued as same as, for example, the scientific knowledge and so on. So about this knowledge of a place, what is the best way of for us, you scientists, to listen? How to listen and learn from the people who really know the place by heart.
Well, I've often talked about with conservation colleagues that it would be really great to see the science, for example, of ornithology. If you're studying wading birds on the Macher and whatnot, the best place to do that is on the Macher. It's not in an office in Glasgow or Peterborough with these things. It's about getting out there and doing that. So it's probably, and particularly nowadays, the excuse used to be that you needed a big university library on your doorstep. Now all these things are digital. You can dial in and download these things wherever you are. So we need to take these things out to the community. The discussion today with the social care, for example, one of the key points was that about speaking to the community and using the networks within the community to disseminate the research on a collaborative basis, because the academics didn't know who to speak to. They didn't know who to talk to with these things. So it was about getting into that using local organizations, about looking at historical societies or land trusts or various groups, mother and toddler groups and so on, to try and get into meeting with people to discuss these things. And that is really quite critical, I think, in terms of making these connections out beyond individuals. I think the idea of place, when people think about, it isn't about saying that necessarily my place is better than yours. It's about my place is as good as yours, and you like where you are, I like where and this is why I do that. This is why I'm into that, and try to explain that and break these things down. I'm working on another thing just now. I've got another book coming out in June, but that's on merlins and ecology of merlins, but including Icelandic merlins and a good one. There's some nice stories there, but the one I'm working on just now is about the similar vein between the non-fiction and the fiction, the non-fiction and the stories, and looking at habitats and looking at understanding. A lot of conservation stories or natural history books about areas are simply lists of the species you find there. They don't tell you about the ecology, the interaction between the species, why they're there, how they've grown, and so on and so forth. And so I want to look at what encapsulates these habitats, whether it's the Macher or the moorland or the upland or whatnot. And then the next chapter is going to be about a short story with a character based in that landscape, who's living in that habitat, and how they cope or how they relate to that things and what they do within that habitat. So that's what's keeping me busy just now. And I think that's about looking for different ways to interpret. I have loads of stories from the past about scientists that I worked with and my colleagues, whatnot, who really were quite dismissive about local knowledge and awareness because they talked about it in a different language. They didn't use scientific language to talk about these things, and so they were quite dismissive. Where in fact they knew just as much as they did, but they couldn't form it in the same language or whatnot. So there needs to be some sort of come and go on the dialogue to try and put these things together.
If I can comment a little bit on that, that is what I always felt, that the European Union is all about co-creation with the communities in the research, but you come in there, you have your scientific knowledge and you have your scientific methods of getting data and so on, and you are using them. Those methods, but you're not. And what kind of a co-creation is that? I ask myself. I mean, you have questionnaires, you have focus groups meeting, or whatever you have, but these are scientific Western methods there are different ways, methods that local people use, but we are not listening to that. And this is the Arctic research project we are going to starting soon is going to deal with how do we really co-create and share knowledge. So that's a challenge. Yeah.
I look forward to hearing about that in the future then. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, we need to have a Teams meeting, Frank.
Yeah, anytime.
Yeah.
One of the good things about retirement is I've got empty diary for weeks on end. Everything is flexible nowadays.
Yeah, that's good.
Just churning out books, it seems.
Apart from lambing, the lambing starts this weekend, and after that, the next week is not very flexible because the lambs could be popping out anywhere. But apart from that, it's fairly flexible.
Battle stations during lambing season, anyway. Janet, you had your hand up. Do you want to come on in?
Yeah, it's actually Andy, Janet's husband. Thank you very much, Frank, for such an interesting talk. I'm actually hearing and wondering if this is really in a way about mythology, but not mythology in the sense that it's a set of stories that are fairy stories that are based on untruth, but actually that every one of us has a personal mythology that's about how we see and experience the land and see ourselves together. And the community that you've talked about is actually where we share that mythology to some degree. You know, for some people, their mythology is actually their sitting room parlor or their garden. And I mean, that's not to disagree with you that I think the land is important and that a sense of place, but ultimately how people interact is influenced by the land very much, and maybe small places and remote places allow different sorts of interactions. But ultimately, what really matters, I'd suggest, is in some ways not even the culture, but actually the values and behaviours that it creates within the society in which we live. And you know, we've recently just been to Finland and very much enjoyed going there, been interested in this whole Finland being the happiest place, also seen some of the, not at very close hand, but been interested and visited some of the cultural places that tell the story of the Sami people and, you know, some of the tensions with the rest of the Finnish population. And I really wouldn't say that I could say I understand that place at all, but one of the things that I do find attractive, and I wonder if people find attractive coming to other places, and we've talked about Lews tonight, is the values and the behaviours of a community rather than simply just, inverted commas, the culture.
Well, that to me is an integral part of culture. The way you treat people, and the way you think about people, and the way you think about the land, the way you think about people around you, and what you do and how you do it. The use of even the language. I mean, you used, and I'm not picking you up to correct you, but you used the word remote, which is one of my trigger words. You know, remote from what is the answer? You know, I mean, I don't feel as if I'm remote at all. I think, you know, London, Edinburgh, Newcastle, New York, they're remote because they're far away from me, but I'm not remote. And very often we talk about rural places, and I don't just mean in Scotland, we talk about rural places in a pejorative manner. We talk about them as if rural places are dead-end places, they're, you know, back of the sticks, everything's backward, old-fashioned, broadband doesn't work. You know, the cities where things are happening, it's buzzing, it's exciting, everything's fast-moving. Actually, for example, you know, today we're talking about, there are many places in cities where the broadband is a hell of a lot worse than it is in the rural parts of the Highlands and Islands. So it's not one size fits all entirely. And the idea that we talk about these things in a certain way, we talk about them as remote places. And, you know, I did a film, which you'll get on YouTube, actually, if you just go into YouTube and search for me again. It was called Aring, HARAINN. It's Gaelic for habitat, and it was about what makes a place special. What triggers these things to make a place special. I contrasted the Hebrides with Orkney and Shetland. My mum's side of the family were from Orkney, but Shetland is very much like the Western Isles. The Hebridean terrain is quite different from Orkney. And looking at some of the things that have in common with these things, and in part that was triggered by it was for the Year of Scotland Stories, so it was the local Atlanta, the local art gallery commissioned me to go and do this through Creative Scotland. But the thing that really sort of made me get off my seat to go and do these things was that series by Ben Fogel of touring the islands and whatnot, which I thought was bloody awful. He went to all these different islands, and he went to the islands, and there was another remote island and a remote beach on the remote island, and he spoke to somebody that had been there for 10 minutes that gave him the history of whatnot, why they'd be there, whatnot, and then he went to the next place, and you got no impression whatsoever about the actual place, because it was all viewed from the lens of somebody there from far away that was looking at this as an exotic, I don't know, breakaway holiday or whatever else, some sensational thing. There was no attempt to get literally under the skin or into the soil of these places and to try and trigger that. So to me, that would be part of the culture. The culture is the way. I remember speaking to Anna Godwin mentioned working with an Inuit community there. We had a visiting delegation many years ago from an Inuit community looking at and land and community development here, and one of my colleagues said to this chap, "What do you do the first thing when he was talking about hunting in Greenland and the ice? What do you do when you go to a new area, a place you haven't been to before, part of the land?" And the guy sat on the floor and he pulled his hood up over his head, and he sat there for about 15 minutes just thinking. And we thought, oh my God, must have offended him, or maybe he doesn't understand. And after a while, he opened his hood and looked up again and says, when I go to a place I haven't been before, I listen. And what he explained is, going to that place, he was listening. He was listening to the ice moving. He was listening to the cracking. He was listening for the sound of animals within the area, and so on and so forth. So he was acclimatizing himself to the place, to the physical, spot on the place. He wasn't just on a place, on an island. I talk about being in Lewis, not on Lewis. I think, to me, a perspective of being on an island is a view from far away where people are actually sitting on this lump of rock. When you're here, you're in the whole community. It's all around you. It's in the air. It's in the atmosphere. It's in the community. It's in the people you meet and whatnot. You don't talk about being on London. I'm going down to be on Edinburgh for a few days, right? You don't talk. You're in the milieu of the place, the mix of the place, and it's about part of that same unintentional pejorative language we use about rural areas, of thinking about places that are far away. What we mean is, of course, remote from me, remote from where things happening, from centres of large population or where decisions are made. But actually, if you're on the other end of the telescope, if you're in a place like this, it doesn't really matter a damn if you're 2 minutes away from Sainsbury's or not, because I'm half an hour from Stornoway to the nearest supermarket, so it doesn't matter how far it is to Sainsbury's, because I'm not going to get it anyway. So it's about that, thinking about these things in a wider perspective. I think it's part of that. And that's why I was talking about the layers of the land that are multifaceted. It's not one is right and one is wrong. It's about different layers of things and different, it's almost like filters on a camera that you look through and you see things differently in different lights and different places. And all of a sudden you think, my goodness. So I discovered a new well. For in the previous book, in the Outer Hebrides book, I mentioned within this village, it's all about this village. This is a place which is called in Gaelic Tobruchan. It's full of wells. So there are lots of sweetwater wells within this, maybe square mile community, let's say. And I relocated a number of these things that were used quite recently in historical times, and some of them are named. We've got one just outside my window here that's named after my wife's grandfather, for example. So they're named after particular people within the landscape or particular stories within the landscape. But just a few the start of winter there in the end of autumn, I found a new well. I took a shortcut because the weather was going to be all of a sudden a downpour of rain, and I was going to get caught. So I took a shortcut across a place I wouldn't normally go, across someone else's croft. It's unused. And I more or less fell into an old well that is not marked on any map, and it's not named. And I've checked with several people within the area who are known oral historians and custodians of Native Americans might say elders in the community, as it were, who know a lot about the history going back and back. And Gaelic folk culture is incredible. The people will go back 10 generations with people in a way that you wouldn't normally do within an urban environment nowadays. And nobody knows where this well came from. And I think actually it was probably a pre-clearance well. So you're talking about probably last time it was used by the early 1800s within the community. So there are things that are discovering all the time. It's this hidden landscape that Neil Gunn talks about. There are things that are popping up all the time. There are birds moving in. There are hen harriers moving in to Lewis now for the first time ever. Hen harriers have never been in Lewis. They've been in Uist, North Uist, but only in the last few years have they begun to move into Lewis, and they're spreading really, really fast. Great skewers, I mentioned earlier on, that reading I gave there, Bonxes came here in, I guess, late 1970s, overspilled from Fuller and from Shetland. They weren't here before that. And so there's a whole range of these things. I've got a paper out currently in the current edition of Scottish Birds, the Bird Journal of the Scottish Ornithology Society. I've got a paper on Gaelic place names in the Hebrides in relation to birds. And there are hundreds of place names that are named after birds and ornithological associations, which, if you don't understand any Gaelic at all, you look at that completely blank on a map and don't understand it. So I was doing a study in the 1980s about terns, for example, Arctic and common terns. And one of my friends visited that, came back all enthusiastic and said, I found a new colony for you. Oh, brilliant. I was really quite pleased. That's fantastic. We got the maps out and I said, where is it? And he put his finger on the map and he said, right there. And I took his finger off the map and the place name was called Blarn and Stjarnog, which is the field of terns. So I said, Bill, that's been known for probably 200 years as a place where terns are. It's not a new colony at all. We know about that one. So unless you know these things, you can't look at the landscape and interpret the landscape. One of the colleagues from an ornithology was asking the other day, why are there no names for bonxes? Why are there no names for skewers? Why are there no names for corncrake in the landscape? And I think there are different stories behind that. I think the skewers are probably relatively recent arrivals over the last, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years perhaps. They weren't here when the Ordnance Survey maps have been created in that sense. But the corncrakes were everywhere. And I think corncrakes were probably so plentiful in the landscape, there was no point in calling that Corncrake Hill, and because there's another one over there and another one over there. So it was just so commonplace within the landscape, it wasn't even worthwhile commenting on. That's just my personal theory, because I found no names at all. And yet this is still this area, this 20, 30 mile stretch here is still one of the real heartlands, strong lands for corncrakes within the UK and within Scotland. The Highlands are the nerve centre for that, and yet there's no mention of them in the landscape whatsoever. So there are things behind that you can dig into and delve out that are quite interesting to tease out and quite tantalising.
We've got comments and things in the chat, but I'll let you read them, Frank, when you get a chance. I'm just conscious of time, so maybe what we can do is Joanna's got a question, and then I can maybe hand back to you, Frank, for some final thoughts. So Joanna.
Hello, Frank.
Hello there.
It's been a long time.
It's a long time indeed.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny how we've kind of tracked, even though, we've sort of like diverged, along the way, but also come back. It feels like a bit like being at home with listening to you all talking. And actually, interestingly enough, the place in Latvia where we have our farm is called Griezietas, which is concrete.
Oh,
And
wow.
and it was actually called that because it was divided land. Somebody else had owned it. They divided it up and said, and they had to find a name. And she said, "Oh, I used to hear concretes when I was younger. We'll call it concrete." So Griezietas. But also within my PhD, actually, I had a figure that I used, which was boats on the sea sort of thing, and anchors. And it was sort of like as we go through life with the memories, the connections, the social connections, etc. We throw out anchors, but sometimes they get cut. So people move away. Your social anchors get cut, and that's been quite helpful for me to sort of think about where I am, because I mean paradoxically, because I now live in Latvia but work in Estonia, so I'm up and down quite a lot. The society has, I've become a bit detached from it. So that's kind of got cut, and it's very unsettling. But yeah. And the other thing that I'd like to say is one thing that I do say time and time again: the cities will not be resilient until the rural areas are resilient, and we need to remember that.
Yeah, very much so.
That's me finished. Thank you for this. Like I said, feels like home.
Very good, very good. Lovely. I see a comment there about connected by the seas and whatnot. Yeah, that, again, in the previous book, I've written about this entirely because when people 1,000 years ago traveled by boat, if you had a boat, you could go anywhere. There were no roads, there were no cars, there were no minibuses. You had to walk, or maybe if you could afford it, to ride on horseback. But apart from that, if you had a boat, you could go anywhere. So islands weren't remote. They were the nodes where people went to, that were attracted towards. They were the sort of key focal points that drew people in there. And this is why you have things like the Pilgrim Trail, the Columban missionaries that came up there from Ireland all the way at the west coast of Scotland and Faroe and into Scandinavia, into Iceland, right through, because they were following these areas of trade and of Atlantic. I mean, the Vikings had a monopoly on whalebone ivory for carving, for these scrimagers, and so it was part of their culture within that sort of thing there. I found a brooch on the shore here about 35 years ago, which is bronze inlaid with enamel, which is, there were only two found like it, but one was a Viking grave in Norway and one was a Viking grave in the Isle of Man, and the third one was here. So it shows the interconnection. They were probably made in the same workshop, actually. They were so similar. So there was interconnection of the Celtic seaway along these different areas. So this is like the M1 of its day. This is a busy, buzzing place. Let me just read a bit about that when I was about thinking about how that comes in there. And this is the last bit I'll read to you about whatnot. But so this is about the interlinking layers, how these things are interconnected. So as an islander and an academic, a person who is closely involved both in the natural environment and the human culture of this place, I've occasionally asked my colleagues if they recognise a specific epistemology of place. There's a certain specific theory of knowledge that we use to describe the interlinked land-based systems of the natural environment. It's how we think about the build-up of knowledge. Is there a multidisciplinary but interconnected way to think about islands that systematically thinks of alternatively to the way in which we learn about non-island places? And if that is so, what is it that differentiates the ways of learning? Predictably, the responses vary, and it seems to me that often they are conditioned, as Neil Gunn speculated in his essay on Landscape Inside, that the shadowy ground between the individual experience and general experience is where, quotes, in this particular region of the mind, places and people meet, the outer and the inner landscapes merge. That was a quote from Neil Gunn's essay, lovely essay. Intriguingly, I've also read that in the Apache language, the root word for land is the same as the word for mind. And elsewhere, Gunn has written that taken together, these realizations produce a moment of heightened understanding by going beyond the boundaries of conscious and limited intellect. To my colleagues, I've likened this to rereading a favorite book several years later and discovering new meanings, because in the intervening years between the first and second reading have been contextualized, and you contextualize the knowledge accumulated in the interim. And this might be similar to the phenomenon by which, having been made aware of something for the first time, we suddenly begin to see examples almost everywhere we look, and we wonder why we haven't seen it before. Is this really a new phenomenon, or is it something we've lacked the specific awareness previously to notice that when we see it? So it's like when you hear sometimes when you hear a strange word and then you hear it again and again and again, I think, I never heard that before, and all of a sudden you hear it 4 times in the 1 week. You know, did you just pass over it before, or did you just not notice it before? These things, the famous quote, I think it's Richard Dawkins talks about that, about the connection between thinking about, if I'm thinking about Andrew and suddenly he phones me, I think that is really weird. I was just thinking about you just now. Isn't that really spooky? What you're not counting is all the times I've thought about Andrew, Lyndon, and he hasn't phoned me. You've just airbrushed that out of history. So it's not some sort of supernatural fact. It's just a coincidence that comes about because of numerical probability. Maybe that's too heavy for this time of night.
Well, I was just going to ask you, Frank, any other final thoughts before we wrap things up?
No, that was lovely. I've really enjoyed talking about that. I hope it wasn't too rambling, because it's difficult to know. You get to a stage there where you've sort of inhaled the book and you forget. When I go back and read it again, I sometimes think, oh my God, did I write that? That's just.
Well, your reaction is probably better. Normally, when I go back and read things, I go, God, I wrote that. So, but I think all that's left for me to do is just thank everyone for coming along tonight, and especially to thank Frank and giving up his time and having a really interesting and far-ranging conversation there. So I'd like everyone to join me in the traditional awkward round of applause where it's only me clapping in front of you. But thank you very much, Frank, for coming along. The last thing that I need to do before I let everyone away for the evening is just to remind folks that we will be back next month for the next installment in the seminar series. We'll be come back on Thursday, the 24th of April, where we'll be joined by our very own Dr. Paul Mulgratty, who will be giving a paper on the Caledonian antizyzygy, origins, legacy, and solution of a paradox. So make sure to keep your diaries free. We will see you then, and from everyone at INS, have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good night, folks.